Greetings. Welcome to week 13. This is probably actually our last lecture, um, focusing on early modern travel literature, specifically Columbus, Hans Staden, Bartolomeo de las Casas, and Michel de Montaigne. So, Christopher Columbus, I know a lot of us have know about Columbus already. But if you're like me, in elementary school, I was given this very kind of different narrative of Columbus. So I think it is important to kind of talk about him. He's born in Genoa, Italy, in 1450. He's of no particular lineage. He is an experienced sailor, but he's sort of monomaniacal in his quest to make a name for himself as an explorer. He proves pretty inept at handling his men. Rebellions break out under his leadership, and he only trusts his family members. Um, and his whole project in life, and again, it's partly because of the fact that he's not of noble birth, and he kind of wants to make a name for himself. Um, is that he wants to sail from Spain to Jipangu or Japan, um, which nobody had done before at this point. And he wanted to reach Japan for a few reasons. First of all, overland trade routes with Asian markets were heavily taxed by the Ottoman Empire. If you look at a map here, again, Columbus is actually Italian, even though he sails on Spain's behalf. He gets funding from the Spanish crown to take his voyage across the Atlantic. But if you'll notice, Europe over here, Spain and Italy, if they want to get any goods from Persia, they have to kind of go through this the Ottoman Empire, who are heavily taxing things moving from east to west. The second reason is that King Ferdinand II of Spain seeks allies against the threat posed by the Holy Roman Empire by the Ottomans. So the other thing to keep in mind here is that France, Spain, Portugal, and Italy, most of Europe at this point is allied under the religious banner of Catholicism. They call themselves the Holy Roman Empire. So these are all Catholic powers at this time. And again, the Ottoman Empire here is an Islamic power. So these are forces that are at odds during this time. And King Ferdinand basically sees this power growing, and he thinks he needs all the help he can get. So that's one reason he's interested in sort of seeing if any allies across the Atlantic Ocean are willing to lend a hand. And the third reason is that trade routes from Europe to Asia had not yet been discovered. Da Gama, I think, had sailed around the southern tip of Africa at this point, but had not yet sort of made the voyage all the way to Asia by traveling around the African Cape. So Columbus also if you're wondering why I'm saying Chipangu instead of Japan, Columbus gets the idea to go to Japan after reading about the Great Khan in Marco Polo's travels. And Marco Polo, this is important to keep in mind because Marco Polo, yes, really did travel. Here's kind of a map of where he went. He traveled around Asia, which a lot of European merchants had not done during this time, and he wrote about it extensively. And he describes the Great Khan, who's the king of China. The Great Khan has every right to this title, for everyone should know that the Great Khan is the mightiest man, whether in respect of subjects or of territory or of treasure, who is in the world today or who has ever been. And kind of goes on about how great this king is. And if you read this and if you believe it, of course, that sounds like, oh, what a great ally for the Spanish. The trouble is that just to point out that this for a minute, that Marco Polo also embellished a lot of his narrative. He wrote about people. He wrote about encountering people who had the heads of dogs. He wrote about people who had stomachs in their or their faces were in their stomachs. So if you read the entirety of his narrative, you can tell that he is embellishing things partly because he wants to kind of sell his travels as this kind of this thing that people will want to read. So it's actually hard to kind of make sense of what is true and what is fable if you read Marco Polo. But I think it's important to keep in mind that when Columbus read Marco Polo, he took everything kind of as truth and was expecting to find exactly that when he arrived in Asia. He asks for patronage from several other countries before Spain finally agrees. He goes to England, he goes to Portugal, who thought his idea to sail across the Atlantic was too far-fetched. Eventually, the Spanish crown gives him patronage. He sails from Spain during a defining moment of religious and national identity. So in 1492, a couple things were going on in Spain. One was the fall of Granada, which was the end of Islamic rule in Spain. If you look at these maps over here in the year 790, everything that's green here was actually belonged to the Moors, or the Islamic Africans who had invaded this peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, centuries before. So again, in 790, that's still largely under Islamic rule. In 900, it's a little less. In 1150, it's a little less. And then finally, there's only kind of one little part holding out. And then in 1492, the whole peninsula basically comes back under Spanish rule. And during this time as well, the Jews are also expelled from the Iberian Peninsula. So Spain and Portugal during this moment are very much kind of defining their national identity against Judaism and against Islam and African Moors. So Columbus sets sail and he arrives in the Indies on October 12th, 1492, which I just want to point out is also hurricane season. I think it's a miracle that Columbus made it. If you think about, what goes on in the Caribbean around September and early October, there are a lot of pretty vicious storms. What does he take with him? So he takes an astrolabe, a ship's compass. He takes a map with him that basically, this image here is a representation of kind of what the ocean actually looks like, with North and South America at the end of the Atlantic Ocean. And the brown part of this map is kind of what Columbus was imagining he would find. So he kind of knew about all this, but he thought, by the time he got to about where Mexico is, he would hit Japan. He thought this big island here was Japan, and that beyond that was China. So he also takes letters from King Ferdinand to the Great Khan. Again, Spain is trying to form this alliance to help them against the Ottomans. He takes Marco Polo's travels with him and the travels of Sir John Mandeville, which is another book of journeys, book of travels, but also kind of just as outlandish as parts of Marco Polo's book. Again, encountering people who are part animal, that kind of thing. He takes an Arabic translator with him because, again, he anticipates meeting a population who speaks Arabic. And he also unwittingly takes smallpox with him, which many Europeans were kind of immune to at this point, but which the New World populations had no exposure to. And what he brings back some samples of kind of the wood and the basically the resources. And one thing I want you to pay attention to when you're reading the letter that he writes is the way that he describes the land that he is encountering. Because if you're reading between the lines, you can kind of hear him almost saying, look, this land has everything we need. This is we could set up factories here. We could set up colonies here. We could live here, and we could actually profit off of this land because of how rich the environment is, right? And if you remember, it might even sound a little bit like the way that Odysseus describes the Cyclops' island, right? Look at all the potential here. The main thing that he takes back that encourages Ferdinand to fund another voyage is gold. And he also brings back a few of the people he encounters as slaves with him. And he also brings back syphilis. This isn't talked about in the reading that we had today, but here's an image of kind of what syphilis can do to you in the late stages of it. It's a sexually transmitted disease that did not exist in Europe or the quote unquote old world before Columbus encountered indigenous Americans, which kind of, again, if you're reading between the lines, suggests that there was some raping and pillaging going on, even though Columbus obviously doesn't talk about that. One thing to keep in mind here too is when he says, "I have taken possession of this land," which he says several times, he just kind of says, we took possession of it, right? But what does that actually mean? Dullus Casus provides a little bit more context here. This is not in the reading that I had you do from the excerpt in the book, but elsewhere in his writings, he talks about what the Spanish would actually do. And to summarize this long passage, basically, whenever the Spanish learned that there was gold in a particular village, they would walk into a town in the middle of the night where the inhabitants were all in bed or sound asleep, and they would read this edict that basically said, be it known to you that there's one true God and one Pope, one King of Castile, who's the rightful owner of all these lands. You're hereby summoned to pay allegiance. Should you fail to do so, take notice that we shall make just war upon you, and your lives and liberty will be forfeit. And again, it's important to keep in mind that whoever is reading this in a basically an empty town square where everybody's asleep, nobody's listening, nobody even speaks Spanish, so they clearly don't understand what is being said. And there's no effort made to translate what's being said. And of course, when nobody complied with these demands, that's when you get they just started burning down the villages, right? So this is kind of how the Spanish exploited the land for resources, exploited the people, and again, it's all kind of very veiled by Columbus just kind of saying, "I have taken possession of the land." The other thing I want to keep in mind here is that the myth of the cannibal was born with Columbus, which I think is personally interesting. I taught a whole class last semester on cannibals in literature, and we looked at all this stuff in a little bit more detail. But I stress here that it is a myth. The word cannibal actually comes from the way Columbus was told to pronounce the island of the people who occupied the island of Carib, the Carib people. He kind of translated that as cannibal because he learned from the Arawaks who he encountered that the people over there on that island eat each other. But if you look at what he actually takes as evidence of that, he finds human bones. But does a human bone mean that a human ate the flesh off of that bone? I think there's a logical leap being made here. Hans Staden, to move right along here, is a German gunner captured by the Tupinamba Indians in Brazil, who are also supposedly cannibals. And the threat of cannibalism here in his brief narrative sort of promotes this need to convert or destroy these savages, quote unquote, and it justifies the European annexation of the Tupi land and resources. Dullus Casus is a really interesting figure. He's a Spanish priest who actually participates in a lot of the conquest of Hispaniola and Cuba. So he basically is one of those guys going into town and burning down the village when nobody surrenders their gold. But he also experiences this amazing conversion, and he's one of the few voices that ends up condemning Spanish atrocities against the indigenous peoples of New Spain. He's critical of this requiremento, the requirement that the Spanish read a document in Spanish to the indigenous population prior to a military attack. And he's also critical of the legal protection and wages in return for work and land for the Spanish crown. He saw the Native Americans as potential Spanish subjects. And if you want to see a map here, I'll post these online here. But the last thing I want you to look at here is Montaigne's essay, which is he's also encountering, talking with Tupinamba, who had been brought back to France. Montaigne never actually traveled to Brazil himself, but please take a look at this essay and some of these questions. And yeah, thank you.